So we've talked about the rapid and accelerating pace of change. We've talked about the need to embrace and embody strategic leadership. And yet in our work with independent schools, we see so many struggling at the same time to wrap their arms around this change, to innovate, and to be forward thinking. So our question as consultants and independent school experts is, what's holding us back? Why aren't independent schools evolving? And what I'll show in a few slides is across sectors, independent school or not, fear continues to be one of the greatest barriers to innovation. And unfortunately, independent schools are no exception. As we see in the chat, you're navigating enormous pressures around enrollment, parent expectations, finance, building community trust. And at the same time, if I were to look at a lot of your mission statements or your curriculum, I imagine that your independent schools are deeply committed to preparing your students for a rapidly changing world, for them to embrace resilience, to be adaptable, and to be lifelong learners. And so what's interesting is we emphasize these skills, we want our students to embrace them, and at the same time, what we often see is that the independent school operating environments unintentionally discourage the same behaviors that we're trying to cultivate in our students. This is fascinating data around organizational culture and innovation. What we see in the data is around 85% of organizational leaders, report that fear often or always holds them back. Of that 85%, only a quarter of organizations really understand this fear. And of that 25%, only 11% of organizations do something about this fear. And so what we see is an interesting dynamic that's twofold. One is that fear is actively holding us back from innovating, and also that fear, whether we recognize it or not, is deeply embedded into our organization's culture. Again, as I mentioned at the top, is what's striking is that the skills that are most consistently identified in our survey research with independent schools are critical skills developed through uncertainty, experimentation, and failure. So when we field surveys to parents and to faculty and to students, we often ask, what are the skills or qualities, experiences that students need to thrive in today's world? And we often hear skills like critical thinking, risk-taking, resilience, lifelong learning, adaptability.
The ability to fail is a big one.
Yeah.
And get back up.
The ability to fail, yeah, resilience. And we, as independent schools, are tireless in the fact that we want to instill these skills in our students, but oftentimes as school leaders, as board members, we don't model these skills ourselves. We encourage students to take intellectual risks, to learn from mistakes, persist through discomfort or challenge, but school leaders at the same time feel likely this immense pressure to avoid visible failure altogether. I love this example from the startup world, and that is 75% of venture-backed startups fail, and nearly half never even reach profitability. And what's interesting is if you think about the independent school space, are we allowing our heads of schools to have that same flexibility or the same growth period as we allow startups? Or are we expecting our heads of schools to be successful 100% of the time in full public view? And so in many sectors, experimentation and failure are just widely understood as part of the process. School leaders, on the other hand, are expected to make high-stakes decisions with very little, if at all, room for public missteps. And so that creates fundamentally different environments in which you can innovate in.